In November of 1941, a 23-year-old woman was wheeled into an operating room. She had a history of mental disturbances and become difficult for her family to manage, so they opted to undergo a promising new procedure that was shown to cure personality disorders. Once in the operating room, the doctor strapped her to a table, the surgeon grabbed an ice pick-shaped instrument, inserted it into the patient's eye socket, and then... That woman was Rosemary Kennedy, the younger sister of President John F. Kennedy. And the surgery was not a success. Rosemary's specific diagnosis isn't entirely clear because the family did everything they could to hide her condition, but by all accounts, she was mentally challenged. And as she entered her early 20s, she became more irritable, difficult to control, sometimes physically violent. There were also rumors that she was sexually promiscuous and just in general behaving in ways that were embarrassing for one of the most powerful political families in the world. The procedure was a prefrontal lobotomy. It was a surgery that's about as terrifying as they come, but it was hailed at the time as a giant leap forward in the treatment of mental illness. This was before psychiatric drugs like we have now. In fact, it won the Nobel Prize for Medicine in 1949. But within a decade of winning the highest acclaim in medicine, the procedure was considered barbaric and outlawed, partly because of people like Rosemary Kennedy. Because Rosemary's condition didn't improve after the lobotomy. She was permanently incapacitated, unable to walk, unable to speak, and incontinent for the rest of her life. And she was far from the only person to receive this procedure. Did I mention the lobotomy van? Yeah, there was a lobotomy van. If you're not really familiar with what a lobotomy is, it's a procedure that's about as simple as it is brutal. A patient is placed under sedation or general anesthesia, and then a doctor takes an ice pick-like thing that they call an orbitoclast, inserts it into the corner of the patient's eye, and then taps it with a mallet-like thing that they call a mallet. Because why even bother trying to make it sound less brutal? And by the way, you clicked on a video about lobotomies. This is going to get a little bit gnarly. You've been warned. By driving the ice pick into the brain with the mallet, the surgery was thought to cure severe mental illness. And there were multiple types of lobotomies, which were also, by the way, called leucotomies. That's another way of putting it. The one I just described is called a transorbital lobotomy, because it goes through the orbit of the eye socket. There was also a transcranial lobotomy that went through the top or side of your head. But this obviously required drilling through the skull. And these used a syringe-like tool called a leucotome to pierce the brain, and then it did its business inside of the brain with a little wire loop, or by injecting a sclerosing agent to harden the fibers. But the goal of all of these was to disrupt the prefrontal cortex of the brain, so they're often called prefrontal lobotomies or prefrontal leucotomies. Now, I know all this sounds grotesque and insane, but there was a reason why they were so popular for a while. It's because the alternative was even worse. There's a stigma around mental illness. Always has been, and it's still there today. But it used to be much, much worse. Because we didn't really understand how the brain worked. I mean, we barely even knew how the body worked, but especially the brain. People thought your emotions and your personality came from your soul. So if you were messed up in that department, it was a soul thing. It was a spiritual thing. A religious thing. So most people back then thought that mental illness was some kind of divine punishment or demonic possession, which came with just some really swell treatments. The first treatment is actually one of the very first surgeries that we have evidence for, and that was trepanation. Trepanation is quite simply drilling a hole into someone's head to, let the demons out. It's thought that they might have done this for mental health reasons, again, attributing to a demonic possession or something like that, or they may have just used it for headaches. But yeah, we found skulls with holes in them going back 7,000 years, and in a lot of these skulls, the hole had healed over, so they did survive this procedure. In the late Middle Ages, bloodletting and purging were often used to treat mental illness, which should come as no surprise because they treated pretty much everything like that. Yeah, they were all about the four humors at that time, so they blamed everything on an imbalance in the humors being blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. This went all the way back to ancient Greek times, but it was an English physician named Thomas Willis that made the connection between the humors and mental illness. Which, while it sounds silly now, it was kind of groundbreaking at the time. I mean, to blame someone's emotions and behavior on a physical issue and not demon possession was incredibly enlightened. So all of that draining of blood and forcing people to puke and torture, that's much more humane. Hey, that's foreshadowing. In the 17th century, we started to see a proliferation of asylums for the mentally ill in an effort to kind of take them out of society or sweep them under the rug. But it was also kind of justified as a place that would be best for them because at the time, isolation was a popular method of treatment. Another popular treatment was called the bath of surprise, which was common practice in many of these asylums. It kind of became a thing in the 1700s, but it basically involves sedating a patient by dunking them in ice cold water with no warning. Again, this was before any of the drugs that we have today that would calm a patient down, but yeah, it turns out that a little Dunkarino in the old ice bath can kind of shock a person into calming down. Which I'm sure there's many people out there in the ice bath cult that are like, yes, that's what it does. It releases dopamine and it calms you down and it shocks your central nervous system. I would just like to point out that you are voluntarily submitting yourself to torture that they used to do to lunatics. Just saying. The bath of surprise, by the way, eventually developed into what's called hydrotherapy, which is where the patient is kind of strapped to a tub for hours or even days on end with continuous cold water piped into it. As the 19th century and the Victorian age came around, institutionalized care was intensified, with asylums and mental hospitals springing up all across the United States and Europe. And at this point, basically just confinement became the prime directive. These asylums were overcrowded and many of the patients were physically violent, so they were mostly just concerned with protecting the staff. This is where straitjackets came in. People were often chained to walls and put in cages. And I don't mean jail cells. I mean like tiny, cramped cages the size of a dog crate for hours, even days at a time. They were subjected to wacky treatments like the rotating chair, which just spun the patients around until they threw up, which again goes back to that purging thing that was based on the four humor, so that was like way behind the times. They would sedate them with drugs, which was arguably ahead of its time, but these were very rudimentary drugs and basically just incapacitated them. And the worst part of it all was that many of the people who found themselves in these asylums were committed for fairly mundane things like epilepsy and melancholy. Willfulness was considered committable, whatever that was. Women were especially targeted. So yeah, if you didn't obey your husband or didn't abide by the crushing Victorian social norms at the time, you could be labeled hysterical and sent off to the asylum. It's safe to say that neurodiversity was not celebrated back then. Not to mention that many of the people who went in there might have just been a little bit different when they first went in, but after 6 months or a year in that environment, they actually did develop mental illness, which only extended their stay and led to more overcrowding. So yeah, none of this was working, and it's a shame because it was all instituted with the best of intentions. These asylums were meant to provide exactly that, asylum. It was supposed to be a respite from the world that was causing them all this mental instability, but it usually just made things worse. At the same time this was happening, though, brain science was progressing and our understanding of the brain was increasing, due in part to some lucky accidents, like one that happened in Vermont in 1848. On September 13th, 1848, a railroad worker named Phineas Gage was tapping down some explosive powder when the powder ignited and blew the tamping rod through the bottom of his cheek and out the top of his head. And somehow, he survived. The Phineas Gage story has been told a million times. I've actually covered it on this channel before. It's remarkable and gruesome and just wild that this guy survived a meter-long iron rod going through his head. But he did. He did not survive completely unscathed, though. Gage's personality changed drastically. Before the accident, he was amiable, well-balanced employee, got along with everybody, but afterwards he became difficult to deal with, easily irritable, he was impatient, he cursed at people a lot, which he never did before. He also developed severe epilepsy, which eventually he died from 13 years later. But it was this change in his personality that got the attention of the psychiatric community. This was the first time that damage to a specific part of the brain could be linked to personality issues, especially emotional regulation. And it started a whole field of study around, like figuring out which parts of the brain control what. There was a motor cortex, there was a language and speech processing area, a visual processing area, long-term memory, short-term memory, and they figured out that the brain kind of evolved from the back to the front. Yeah, so if you look at the brain, at the back of the brain, at the base of the brain, that's what controls sort of your more core functions of your body, your breathing, your digestion, like body temperature regulation, that kind of thing. And as you move forward, it evolves more advanced processing. So it's actually the front of your brain up here, the prefrontal cortex, that handles your personality, your judgment, your emotional regulation, higher core stuff like that. That's why Phineas was able to survive this blast. It didn't go through the back of the brain. If it had gone through the back of the brain, he would have been toast. The fact that he was lucky enough that it went up only through the prefrontal cortex, that's why he was able to survive. So over the next century, more attention had been paid to other, lucky accidents that helped refine our understanding of the brain and its structures. That, along with some animal experimentation that was being done, and actual brain surgery, which was a thing, but it was still in its infancy. All of which came to a head at the Second International Congress of Neurology in 1935, a conference that would change the landscape of psychology and neurology and ultimately